Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Summer Scares adult panel. I'm Becky Spratford, co-chair of the Horror Writers Association Library Committee. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some technical details. Links to Summer Scares resources and information about the program were included in the reminder email you received from Zoom 1 hour ago. To download them, please open that email, scroll to the bottom, and check on the links located there. You can also download them by copying the URLs on this screen into your web browser. If you have any trouble, please contact Booklist at webinars@booklistonline.com. The audience is in listen-only mode, but we welcome any questions you may have. On the bottom of your screen is a toolbar with a section for Q&A. If you have a question or need technical assistance, simply click Q&A and type your message into the box that appears. Booklist will respond to all technical related questions, and we will do our best to get as many of your questions as we can during the conversation. Booklist offers closed captioning on all webinars. To enable or disable them on your screen, please look for and click the Show Captions icon on the toolbar mentioned earlier. If you choose to enable subtitles, you can adjust the size of them at any time by selecting Caption Settings. And finally, Booklist expects all participants to maintain an atmosphere of respect and fairness. Anyone who violates this standard of behavior, including engaging in any form of harassment, may, at the discretion of the organizers, be immediately removed. We'd like to start today's webinar with a brief introduction about the Summer Scares program. For those of you unfamiliar, the Summer Scares reading list includes titles selected by a panel of authors and librarians, and its goal is to promote horror as a great reading option for all ages and during any time of the year, not just in October. The program is designed by the Horror Writers Association in partnership with iREAD, Book Riot, NoveList, and Booklist. As I mentioned earlier, we sent a link to the 2025 Summer Scares programming guide in the reminder email, but please feel free to ask for that link in the Q&A box if you are unable to locate it. We'd be happy to share it with you. Okay, now let's get to the reason we are all here today, our wonderful panel. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from LaRocca, author of Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke and Other Misfortunes from Titan Books, James Han Mattson, author of REPRIEVE from William Morrow, and Caitlin Starling, author of The Luminous Dead from Harper Voyager. We will hear a brief introduction from each author about their book and then move to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So, as is on the screen, we're going to start first with LaRocca, author of Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke and Other Misfortunes. Welcome, Eric, and could you tell us a little bit about your book?
Hi, Becky. Thank you so much for that great introduction. And thank you to Booklist and the HWA and NoveList for organizing all of this. It's really exciting to be here with the other panelists as well. Very, very honored. Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke and Other Misfortunes is a collection of 3 novellas that are all centered around the very desperate need for connection and meaning in our lives, whether that's between like 2 people or meaning from religion or spirituality. The title novella, Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke, which is definitely like the most notable of the 3 stories in the collection, that really deals with the desire to connect with other human beings, especially in online and virtual spaces. So it's about 2 women who become embroiled in a tempestuous affair online, and things disintegrate pretty rapidly in a quick period of time. And then The Enchantment is the second novella in the collection that really focuses on the human need to believe in God or an afterlife. That piece is set in a world where there's been concrete proof that there is no such thing as an afterlife. It's never explicitly stated what this proof is, but that's what it kind of centers the story at the very beginning, that there is no afterlife. And the story concentrates on a couple who lose their son to suicide, and it's about them rekindling their love for one another, and how they become caretakers on a very remote island for this hotel off the coast of New Hampshire. And one night they get a knock at the door, and it's an unexpected visitor that kind of shifts the dynamic for them. So that's what the enchantment is about. And then the final story in the collection is called You'll Find It's Like That All Over. And that really concentrates on the need to maintain social graces, to be polite to our neighbor. It's about a man who uncovers a disturbing artifact in his backyard and is convinced that his neighbor placed it there for him to discover. And he soon becomes embroiled in like a very strange game of betting with this neighbor that escalates and escalates further. So I guess all of the stories in the collection really deal with human need for connection, but also escalation of events and things getting worse and worse and worse. And that's what all of the pieces are about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. And now we're going to hear from James Han Mattson, author of Reprieve. Can you tell us about your book, James?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for including me in this web event. Thank you, Becky, for moderating. It's quite an honor to be chosen for this. So a little bit about Reprieve. Essentially, Reprieve is about a murder that happens in what's called a full contact haunted escape room. If you don't know what a full contact haunted place is, it's basically like, the haunted houses that spring up during Halloween. It's one of those, except it's contact, so like the actors can actually touch you. And these exist. And so the story is about an actual murder that takes place in one of these. It follows three characters on their journey toward this night where the murder happens. So the first character, her name is Kendra. She is a resident of DC who moves. Oh, the haunted escape room is in Nebraska. She moves from DC to Nebraska after the untimely death of her father. And she actually ends up getting a job at the haunted escape room as a parking lot attendant. So she's one point of view character that is present. And then the second one, his name is Jaidi Cherawansak, and he is a Thai international student. So he's from Thailand, and he moves to Nebraska to go to school, but he also has moved there to find a teacher of his that he had in Thailand who lives in the vicinity. And he's actually one of the contestants in the escape room on the night of the murder. I say contestants because if you get through all 6 rooms, you win a cash prize. And then the third point of view character is this guy Leonard Granton, and he's a hotel manager in Nebraska, or in Lincoln, Nebraska, and he's essentially a vendor of the Quigley House, the full contact haunted escape room. And he is very much tied to the actual murder that takes place. And so mostly the story sort of discusses how each of these characters sort of got into the predicament that resulted in this catastrophic event. And so a lot of it is just like a lot of character development and character, like sort of character study, interspersed with actual events that take place in the haunted escape room. Thanks.
Thank you, James. And hot tip before we get to Caitlin, all you people who are looking for White Lotus read-alikes, there's a lot of this book that actually takes place in Thailand and it might be a good place to send some of your readers separate from summer scares. Okay, thank you, James. Next up, we'll be joined by Caitlin Starling, who's here to tell us about the Luminous Dead. Take it away, Caitlin.
Briefly, I will third all of the thank yous to everyone who has brought us here. It's very exciting. So The Luminous Dead was my first novel. It is a science fiction horror story about a young woman named Jair Price, who has lied about her credentials in order to get into a very lucrative but also potentially dangerous caving expedition. It's a solo caving expedition. She is on an alien planet where they have found it is too dangerous for groups to go down. Something always gets them. And so she's going down into the planet wearing a very high-tech suit that she is surgically plugged into that will allow her handlers up on the surface to keep track of where she is, help her deal with problems as they arise, medicate her if necessary. And she finds very quickly that she was also lied to about the terms of the agreement, and there isn't a team up on the surface. There is only one woman whose name is M, who has mysterious reasons for sending her down there. And it becomes a sort of psychological cat and mouse game between the two of them, trying to figure out when they can trust each other, if they can trust each other, how far M is willing to go to get what she wants using M or using Jair as a pawn. And then there's also a whole lot of mother issues bound up in all of it. So yeah, I think that's as much as I want to explain about it for those who haven't read it yet.
I think that's great to get people started. Thank you so much, Caitlin. So we're now going to have everyone turn on their cameras and microphones. We're going to move to the panel portion of the webinar. And I do have some prepared questions, but I want to mention that if you have a question, particularly if it's for everyone, please put it in the Q&A. I already saw one that I think will be really good. But to start off, I'm going to have you all answer sort of the first two prepared questions I sent you together. And a lot of you know this from working with me before. I want to know why you love horror as a fan, as a writer. Maybe you want to talk about your first exposure to horror as a way to get at this. I know Eric's written about this for my blog extensively, but what is it about the genre that you love to explore? And, you know, I think this is important because all three of you look at horror in different ways, and Caitlin, in all of your books, you do it in different ways. So I'm going to start with Eric. So answer that question for us.
Yeah, definitely. I love this question. I get asked it a lot, but I always feel like I always think of Haley Piper when I think of this question because she so succinctly puts it as horror being the genre of honesty. It's such an honest genre. And I think I love that. It really forces us to look at like the car wreck on the highway and really forces us to look at the macabre, the unsettling, the grotesque, without looking away, without kind of averting our eyes. We see the misfortune of others. We see characters going through like the worst possible moments in that a human being can suffer. But we are safe ourselves as a reader. We are not, physically harmed when reading a horror story. Maybe like emotionally, mentally scarred, but we're physically whole after finishing a horror piece. But I love that. And I always think of Haley when I get asked that question. But I also think it's an incredibly cathartic genre. I think that there's a lot of good things that come out of really awful things, which I know sounds contradictory. And then most importantly, there's so much joy I found in just transgressive horror fiction in general. I think of writers like that really shaped my upbringing, like Clive Barker and Poppy Z. Bright and Kathy Koja. I mean, those are writers that were really pushing boundaries, extreme boundaries. But they presented it in such a way that was like palatable and digestible. And there's a joyfulness to their writing. And I definitely try to infuse that same level of joyfulness in my own writing to show readers that there is in a really strange way, like there is joyfulness in this depravity and gruesomeness.
And I tell everybody, I love what you talked about, Kathy Koja, just there, Eric. Is it out yet? The new edition of Skin by Kathy Koja? It's coming out.
It comes out in April.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I reviewed it. It was not for Booklist, but I reviewed it, and he has a really awesome introduction to that book. And
Thank
what
you.
it felt like to encounter that story. I think it was when you were in college, right?
Yeah, I was in college, and I mean, it just completely rewired my brain how horror fiction can change and how we can push the envelope even further. It was just beautiful. And then to have Kathy reach out to me personally and say, like, I'd love for you to write the intro was just such a full circle moment, you know.
I think it's totally worth it to see that. James, what about you? You know, what about horror draws you? I love because in your book, you're writing about the horror industry, and it's such, you get to the heart of why people like it, but also why it's terrifying in this book.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the sentiments in the book are sort of how I think of horror. I mean, I grew up when I was a kid, really, I mean, I read like all Stephen King's books, and I found them very comforting in a way. But I think as I grew up and I sort of analyzed what it was that I really liked about horror, I think it sort of speaks to what Eric said. It's sort of this idea of an authentic self emerging when we're faced with something that's like completely horrific. And I think we go through, and that's something that I think I look for in people in general is like what is sort of their authentic core. And I think it's so masked like daily because sorry, because we have to perform and we have to perform all the time for everybody, you know, constantly. And I think when you're faced with something terrifying, that performance suddenly just stops. And so you get to see something primal. You get to see like what people are really made of when they're faced with something that's absolutely terrifying. And so that is sort of the reason I'm drawn to the genre is because I like to see that moment. I like to see that moment of like the terror is something that is actually like a proxy for some sort of humanity, you know? I also just like the feeling of being uneasy because I mean I think when I'm uneasy there's something happening inside of me, something happening internally that makes me grow as a person. So I think that happens with everything that makes you uneasy or uncomfortable, and like horror definitely does that. It's supposed to make you uneasy, and you know sort of after that period of uneasiness, there's going to be this release. There's going to be a reprieve, so to speak, you know, and that release is quite lovely if you've had this suspended period of suspense, you know, and so I like that feeling of horror too, and just like my first exposure, like I remember the very first image I had in a horror novel was Stephen King's Firestarter. And I think it's the very opening scene where he says, this woman's eyelashes were on fire. And I was like, that is like an incredible image. And I was like, you can do that in horror. You can have those kind of like crazy, incredible images. And I love that.
I love that too. And I feel like your book does everything you talked about, because it does. I say to people about this book, if you don't think you like horror, read this, but no, it has violence. So like, I'm not saying it's like, you know, cozy or non-violent. It has violence, but it's about, right, all about horror, both, you know, the attraction, but also humanity too, that like both of you have talked about. Caitlin, what about you? What I love about your books too is they're all different. I've read all of them. I love them all, but they all have like maybe another adjacent genre too, but there's always horror in there. Like something is getting them down in those minds that she's in for real.
So for a long time, when people would ask me this question, I would, especially about like my history with horror, I'd be like, oh, I was never really a horror kid. In the sense that like I never intentionally sought out like horror books and horror movies and things like that. But like when I've actually thought about it, I grew up on weird corners of the internet. I grew up on rotten.com and all sorts of, I was into true crime, and I was always coming up against these things, like James was saying, made me feel uncomfortable, but also intrigued me. And I was always like, oh, but I'm too anxious. I'm too scared. I can't watch Saw. But then I turn around and I remember renting one of the first horror movies that I intentionally sought out was I watched The Ring, and I got it as a used VHS from Blockbuster, which was a bit too immersive, but I was like 12 and I'm watching it and I kept pausing it to run in to get my dad and be like, come on, watch this with me. And he's like, no, I told you, this is all on you. I don't want to see this. And I was like, no, you got to see these centipedes. It's so cool. And also I'm terrified and I want someone with me. And it was kind of like, it's been that sort of pulling away, going, oh, that's not me. And then finding myself right back in it again. And I think a lot of it is because of that very complex, rich set of emotions that it brings up. It's fascinating to me. I've always been fascinated also by like the horror of logistics, whether that's medical horror and how the body works, or the suit in Luminous Dead, or various things. I like looking at how something is actually going to come together and going, okay, well, what is scary about that? What is interesting about that? What is engaging about that? And I think some of not seeing myself as, or always wondering if I'm really a horror person, is also part of where those additional genres come in. So I've done science fiction horror, I've done Victorian Gothic medical horror with math. I've done, I now have a fantasy horror novel coming out. And it's always fun for me just to take something that is relatively familiar and then go, okay, but how can we like turn the camera just a little bit and find the unsettling and find the unfortunate implications and follow those through. I also really like, especially with writing horror, I like the internality of it. I like how far I can push my characters. I like that I can, if I come up with something completely bizarre, I can put it in there and not be too worried about it being too much. As a quick aside for that fantasy horror novel, it has cannibalism in it. And I had to text my agent being like, can I have this character just pick meat out of a human foot in this scene? Is that too much? And she went, if the story earns it, go ahead for it. And when I came back at the end, when she'd read the whole thing, I went, so about that scene, she goes, it got so much worse. I don't even remember that scene anymore. And like, it was just fun though, that I could do that. And that it wasn't a bad thing that I had let my mind run wild in those directions.
And I'm going to do spoiler alert. It works I know it's not Booklist, but in Library Journal, I'll have a star review of it coming out in a couple days. And we did an interview together. So it's going to be really fun for people to read this book. I want to talk a little bit about right now, and a couple of you touched on it. We're experiencing a horror renaissance right now, that, mainstream acceptance of the genre. What is it? My colleague Robin Bradford in Washington State always says about Eric's books, I cannot keep them on the shelf in any format, right? But we have, like, last week, Stephen Graham Jones's new book came out and got coverage everywhere. And Grady Hendrix was #2 on the bestseller list. Only, I always joke with him, only Rebecca Yarros could beat you, right? So why are we seeing, though, this horror renaissance where people are less afraid to use that H word in their marketing? And is it, because the world's a dumpster fire, or do you think there's more to it than that? And I'm going to start with James, because I think your book really deals with this, and it came out, a bunch of years ago, but it kind of deals with this issue.
Yeah. I mean, I think people a lot of times read horror to escape daily horrors. And there's like a ton of daily horrors that have been happening for quite a long time now. And I think the fact that we have like this perpetual newsreel that keeps spitting out these horrors every day, I think it's sort of, it gets to be much. I think it's taxing on the brain, right? To constantly be like fed all of these terrible headlines constantly every day. And so why would we escape into something even more horrific? I don't know, because it does hold up a mirror to society, but also, like, I think novels in particular, they package the horror in such a way that there is usually something at the end that's sort of enlightening, even if it's not like, happy. There's something that changes. There's some sort of like arc. There's essentially a light at the end of the tunnel that's not necessarily always bright and beaming, but it's there. And I think like we read stuff like that and we like listen to stories and stories in general for that sort of that sort of payoff at the end. And we don't know if we're going to get that in real life. And so like in real life, there's so much garbage that, and we don't know when it's going to end. It seems like it's endless right now, right? But like with these digestible narratives, we're able to see, yes, this does end, and you know, this can end, actually, it could end well, or it can end in a way that makes me think about the world in a different way. So
I like that. Yeah. Caitlin, what about you? Why do you think we're in a horror renaissance right now? And I think it's interesting because you even said I think you're more actively putting in your books as they go on. Maybe you don't realize that.
I'm honestly not sure. My knee-jerk response was to say something about, you know, there's a lot, I feel like with and this is not this is kind of a blanket statement that probably shouldn't be a blanket statement, but I feel like there's a sense of safety in a lot of other media right now, of like, you know what you're going to get, it's going to be relatively sanitized. But then, you know, horror goes, okay, yeah, if we'll give you content warnings if you need them, some of us, but we're going to be doing what, you know, this isn't going to be trope based. We're not doing a trope based book. I like to promote my books with what I like to call, can I swear? I probably can't swear in this, can I?
Probably don't.
I have irreverent trope graphics, we'll say, that kind of, I mean, I came up through fan fiction. I love tropes. Tropes are a great marketing tool, but sometimes you feel like books are being boiled down to the lowest common denominator items in them that may not even be that relevant to why that book is good, why you might love that book. And I feel like horror just kind of throws that out the window and goes, okay, here's a scenario. Do you want to see some people have a bad time? In a way that I feel like is very refreshing. And like, it's I feel like my take on this is not scientific. It's not super validated because, you know, we have this wide selection of books out there. We can pick and choose whatever we want, and there's just this whole smorgasbord available to us. But I feel like horror does bring something a little bit different to how we present these stories, and how we are like, yeah, this might not be for you. We're not writing for everybody. We're writing to tell this particular story, and that's okay.
And I'm going to go to Eric next. And Eric, I really see, and I know you and I have talked about this privately, like your rise in transgressive horror and extreme horror, but that is so thought-provoking, has been parallel with this rise. So I'm really interested in you talking about this also as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I echo, you know, what Caitlin and James have said. I think they make really solid points here. You know, as far as what I think is contributing to the horror renaissance, I mean, I think there's so much diversity now in publishing, which is so important. I mean, we still have a long way to go, but the works that I'm seeing being published by marginalized voices, it's just absolutely wonderful to see. You know, I mean, even like the three of us on this panel, Caitlin, James, and me, I mean, we're all from incredibly diverse backgrounds, and we come at horror with fresh perspectives, different takes on the genre, and I think that's really special, and I think that's contributing to the boom. You know, I think they've already kind of touched on, you know, the world is inherently frightening right now, and horror is a safe space to really explore those emotions, those transgressions. I also feel like the quality of fiction that's being published now is a little bit more sophisticated in horror fiction than in previous eras. You know, in like the 80s and 90s, I mean, you did have like the lyrical Baroque writings of Poppy Z. Bright and Clive Barker. But I see that more now with writers like Gwendolyn Keist and Haley Piper, Paula D. Ashe. I mean, these are all authors who were really influenced by those huge names in horror. And I just feel like we've all been students of the genre for so long, and now it's our opportunity to really come forward and show the world what we have.
Actually, this is a really great lead into a question we had from someone online. And I know that this actually appeals to all of your books. But before I do that, someone asked what my shirt is. It's writer Jenny Kiefer's bookstore, Butcher Cabin Books. It's in Louisville, Kentucky. So that's why I'm wearing it. I'm repping her. She's a great author herself as well. So I'm going to start with Caitlin, because I know you also look at LGBTQ issues in your books as well. Horror has long held appeal with LGBT and other minority groups in general. Where do you think the appeal comes from for these groups and any marginalized groups? And where does it come from for those groups? But also, why are our patrons seeking those books out? And I think all three of you deal with this question. And that was from Brianna. So Caitlin, why don't you go first?
Yeah. So I come at it just from this fact that, you know, I'm a queer woman and I like writing about women and I like writing about specifically queer women. It just comes very naturally to me. But I've been thinking a lot about this going into the promo cycle of Starving Saints and everything, because cannibalism is often kind of like an element of queer desire in a lot of horror media. You know, Interview with a Vampire, NBC's Hannibal, it keeps coming back around, and I've been kind of going, okay, well, why does this keep coming up? I don't have any great, wonderful, or shattering answers for you, except that it is really engaging to kind of play with where's the line of monstrosity. You know, okay, yes, I'm the other. Am I? If people see me as monstrous, am I monstrous? Am I monstrous for the reasons people think that I'm monstrous, or is it something else? You know, you've already taken down some of the barriers of quote unquote respectability, and you get to sort of, I don't know, with at least for my characters, the situations they find themselves in allow them to find the limits of themselves. What are their lines in the sand? What does change how they view themselves and how they value themselves and how they view and value others? And I think that there's just those elements of marginalized identity go along really well with, okay, now wait a second, I don't have to go down any particular path that's already been set out for me. I can choose what I'm going to do. I can exceed these boundaries. I can horrify, I can consume, I can do all these things. And it's just, I'm having a hard time articulating this. It's
No,
lots
you're doing
of big
good.
words, but yeah, just this idea of like self-definition and definition against the world, having a wider variety of answers that you can reach in horror.
I love that. Eric, I want you to talk about this a little as well, because I mean, you actively, I love this about your books, you actively challenge the notion of, oh, I'm gay, I'm gonna have gay characters, but hey, they can do all sorts of horrible things too and can be nuanced. And
Yeah, and that's what I love writing about. Like, I love writing about very complex, morally gray, sometimes just plain awful queer characters. But to answer your question, like, why are LGBTQ plus people really invested in horror? I mean, I would say that pretty much all horror is inherently queer. It's a very queer genre. Horror is about the other. It's about the monstrous, the complex, the uncategorizable, the not easily defined. And that's what queerness is to me a lot of the time. Like, queerness is not so easily defined, and a lot of people don't understand it. And people obviously fear what they don't understand, which is really devastating a lot of the time. But I think horror really speaks to people who feel othered, who feel disenfranchised, who feel like they're on the outside of whatever social circle they want to be in. And that's really what I maintain, and that's what I write about a lot in my own fiction, not just Things Have Gotten Worse, but like a lot of my other books I've published, just about these really morally gray, complex characters doing things that are not binary good or bad. It's impossible to define, good and bad in fiction. I mean, multitudes, we contain multitudes. We're capable of being just more than just a binary scale of good or bad. So I think horror is comforting a lot of the time for queer people, and I know it's been really comforting for me, even fiction that I read with really bleak, unpleasant endings for the queer characters. I find some sort of solace in that. I find some sort of uh, resurrection or transformation in that transgression. It's just it's my favorite thing about the genre, honestly.
James, your book is very much about marginalization, right? The three main characters are marginalized in their own ways. I would argue one of them is mistaken, but we're not going to give that away. But it's really about that. It's really about looking at this one event through these eyes of people who are marginalized in a different way. Is that something that you think appeals for all of horror? Is that something you're trying to look into?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, first of all, I agree with everything that Eric and Caitlin said. When I wrote Reprieve, I wrote it because I wanted to write about racial fetishization. And so I had a cast of characters that was very diverse, and I wanted to talk about their own fetishization in different ways. And how does that relate to horror? Well, I think when you're fetishizing a person, whether or not you're saying that, you love them or you hate them, what you're doing is you're just whittling them down to, a race, or you're whittling them down to like a very not there, you're stripping them of a humanity. And I think that in itself is a horror. It's horrific because you're no longer seeing a person as a person, but you're seeing them as a set of preconceived ideas. And because you don't see them as a person anymore, you're able to do whatever you want with them. And so that's terrifying, and so that's sort of what I wanted to explore with that book. I think just like as an aside, I think sometimes, people are drawn to horror, especially like slashers, because of a certain Schadenfreude. It's like they always cast, the people that were very cruel to outsiders as the people who get slaughtered, and so I think there's a reason that's the case, because we sort of like to see, people that were just generally not nice go through the suffering that we sort of, had to face, I guess, a little bit. I mean, not to say that that's great, but I think that's maybe an appeal sometimes to that.
Oh, I totally see that. It's so interesting. I'm glad this question came through because a few years ago, I was at the American Library Association conference and R.L. Stine was there in conversation with somebody, I think one of the presidents of ALA. And the number of people who lined up to speak to him, first of all, were amazing, but all of them identified as queer, and mostly a lot of them were African-American. Well, they were Black, but almost all of them announced when they got up there, your books were the only things that spoke to me growing up as, and then they identified their marginalization. And it was an extremely moving experience for me to see too, as well. I think you all hit at the different reasons. But James, you brought up movies. So I'm going to go with you with this question that came in. What do you think horror writing can accomplish that horror in other mediums, especially film, cannot? I know I'm throwing this out there. You didn't know about it.
No, okay. I mean, I guess I can answer that generally. I think like, in general, when you're reading something, it becomes your own, even though the author had an intent. When you're reading something, you make the picture in your head, right? Even no matter how much detail the author gives, you are the one who is going to be able to play the image however you see fit. In a film, everything is given for you. I mean, the visual medium is there. It's automatic. And I think there's marked differences between the two mediums. But I think as far as like having more of a personal attachment to the story, I mean, I think this is why people say, just in general, that the book is usually better than the movie, is because it becomes more personal. And so, like, if you're reading a horror novel, it becomes your own personal story. No matter what the intent was, it becomes yours. That's just not the same case for movies, I think. So I think
I love that.
Was that the question? Okay,
yeah. No, it's great. It was from. I mean, I'm throwing these at you, Eric. What about you? What do you think a book can do? Because I know you watch a lot of horror movies too. What a book can do that a movie can't in horror.
I think James really touched on it, that it's really a personal thing between you, the reader, and the book in question. It's something, you are alone, or, maybe you're on the subway or whatever reading, but you're alone with your thoughts. You're alone with these 200 plus, 300 plus pages that you're reading, and you're playing out these visuals in your head, and that to me, like, it's just more powerful than a film. I mean, I love film, I love cinema, I watch a lot of movies. I think film is really important, but that being said, like, I'm always really more invested in a book. It's a much more immersive experience, and especially novellas. I find myself really drawn to novellas. I love novels. I really love being able to sit down and, tear through a novella, like a 100, 200 page novella in like a couple hours. I think that that really provides something that films don't capture entirely, with just the personal touch of it being, you're alone or wherever you're reading it, and you're able to really connect with the author on that really intensely, like, visceral level.
Eric, I will tell this to everyone out there. The first time I read you was things have gotten worse since we last spoke. And I've written, and you can go on Goodreads and see about my experience of sitting there and reading the book and literally being in that novella. I read it in one sitting. I don't know if with a movie I could have kept going, but with a book, I
Yeah.
was in. And that leads to Caitlin's story. There is a lot of claustrophobia in Luminous Dead, and I'm not sure a movie would capture it as well. But what is your thoughts about this issue?
So this is more of a personal take, but the thing that makes it hard for me to watch horror movies, I tend to read instead, like summaries of them, and that's how I engage with a lot of horror movies. I am very sensitive to sound cues in horror movies. I get like freaked out, even if mentally I can handle what's on the screen. My emotions, I start panicking, and it runs away with me. And so horror books to me are actually more accessible. I can get to the parts that I'm interested in without being like jump scared by the sound cues. I actually sometimes that's what I want. Sometimes I want that kind of neural hijacking that great horror films can take advantage of. But sometimes, and for me, it was really like how I started feeling more at home with the genre. Reading is you can do it at your own pace, and yeah, you're at the mercy of what your brain comes up with from what you're reading, but at the same time, there aren't those they're not cheap tricks, they're actually very cool tricks, but there aren't those little the gotchas that you have in film that are there to spark very specific reactions in you. I do recommend though, is if you ever want to, the TV tropes for horror movies are really fun. The TV tropes page for horror movies that you've never seen are really fun to read, because like the way your brain starts putting together what this movie must be like is so much fun.
That's awesome tip. We had a question that I was going to ask you anyway, and someone else asked it, so I'm going to ask it now. This is a library-centered program, so I wanted to get a chance. We'll just be a little less horrific for a few minutes and be more and talk about your experiences with the library, both as adults or as kid. The library audience wants to hear about that. So I think Eric, you haven't gone first in a little bit, so let's go to you.
Yeah, I mean, I love libraries so much. I mean, I grew up in libraries. I grew up in a very rural, isolated town in the northwest corner of Connecticut, and I was an only child. But my mom really instilled in me a love of reading at a really young age, and she would take me to the library every weekend, and I would get like my books that I would read throughout the week. And it was just really special. It was always like a very safe space for me. And then going into high school, I had like the worst high school experience ever, just like constantly bullied and just awful, awful, awful. But the library at the high school was like a safe refuge for me. It was a place where I could go and just be alone and read, engage with the art that I wanted to consume, and, not really deal with the bullies. And I made friends with all the librarians, and it was just amazing. Like, it was just so, so wonderful. So to me, libraries have always been a very safe space. They've always been a very nurturing space. And yeah, and that now, you know, being an author, I get to go around and visit libraries around the country. And I've been to a couple that have just been so, so wonderful to visit. And I hope to get to go to more because I really feel like libraries are just so important for like the soul. You know, you just feel better after having been in one.
Caitlin, what about you?
So I married a librarian's son.
So
But
you are invested.
yeah, but I do have really fond memories of the library I used to go to as a kid, specifically reading like a lot of DK books on Egypt. I went through my Egypt phase, as I think all children do. Um, but also reading like choose your own adventure books and the Tripod series of sci-fi fiction, which I think is what, 60s, 70s. Anyway, just finding stuff that I otherwise probably wouldn't have picked off of a bookstore shelf, because of the depth and the history of what that library had chosen to acquire over the years. I'm now fairly engaged in my local library, and I love taking my kid there, and just yeah, the libraries rock.
What about you, James?
Yeah, I mean, libraries are wonderful. I have fond memories of libraries as well. My father would take me to either he would every Tuesday, my father and I would go somewhere. Um, and it was either the mall or the library. And I didn't, and if when I would go to the mall, I would go straight to B. Dalton's. Um, but I preferred the library. He would sort of just shoo me away upstairs to the kids section. Um, and then, on the first floor, there was the adult section. And upstairs, there was like a big window so we could look down on the adult section and see all the adults doing, their various, very serious stuff. And I remember like just as a kid, like looking down at the adults and thinking that I was going to be there at some point. Like at some point, I was going to be one of those adults doing serious stuff. Um, and it was just really, and I would spy on my dad as he would go through like the go through the shelves, and he would pull out the card catalogs. And it was just like kind of a lovely thing to like look at my father doing something and he didn't know I was doing it. But yeah, I mean, I love libraries.
I feel like you could have grown up with me in New Jersey. I either went to the mall or the library, same thing. Those were great answers. Thank you. There were a couple different questions about horror tropes, other sort of subgenres that people wanted to know. One, which ones are your favorites? But also, and I know, Caitlin, I'm going to start with you because you were like, I don't do tropes. But I mean, there are, you have space horror, but also like things that in horror that you maybe haven't explored yet that you might want to in your next books or in upcoming books. So Caitlin, what about you? Because you do the most broad. You have 2 books coming out this year, right?
3 total.
Oh my goodness.
One's already out, and it was
Right.
not horror. It was actually like a
That's right.
romance novella.
Right.
But yeah, I have 2 more books out this year. So I think at this point I have to admit that my favorite like subgenre of horror is medical horror, like body horror, medical horror from every direction. I've done Victorian surgery. I've done
True.
people who should not be performing surgery doing terrible things to people's eyeballs. I've done, I have an actual book set in a hospital coming out, all this sorts of stuff. I think honestly, cannibalism is almost a subset of it at this point because of how I approach it. I do tropes. I just don't do like the only one bed trope, although honestly, I still love an only one bed trope. I also enjoy romance in my time off, and I read quite widely. I think probably what I would like to do that I haven't done yet. Gosh, I have an idea for like a almost very traditional like cabin in the mountains horror novel. Actually, it was what I was supposed to be writing next for one of my publishers, and then I had this idea come crashing in that's breastfeeding vampires. And so I'm writing that instead. Yeah. But yeah, just this, I kind of want to do like an isolated cabin. I'm slowly expanding the casts of my books. I used to be, 2 people in one cave, and now I'm slowly coming out to like, oh, there are 3 people in a castle with other people in it. Woo, big, very expansive. So I think I would like to do like a group of hikers in the woods sort of thing.
Okay, but also breastfeeding vampires, an entirely new trope.
I have opinions, having just had, you know, my kid a couple of years ago. I had some stuff to work through. And I decided to make vampires even more rancid than I have thought of them before. So hopefully that will be next fall.
Oh, I love this. Okay. What about you, James? I love it.
Wow, breastfeeding vampires.
I know it's hard to
I
top
can't get that out of my head now.
I know, me too.
No, I'm writing like my current project is a ghost story. And I'm, you know, I'm loving it. I'm loving the experience of like writing about, you know, the undead and like its relation to grief and loss and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I would love to try to write body horror. I have never done it before, but I'm sort of
close in this book. You got close.
yeah, a little bit, but like, I mean, seriously, like serious body. I mean, I would like to try that because I'm sort of, I like writing about the body. So, just dismantling it a little bit, it would be, I think, kind of fun. So,
I
yeah.
like that. What about you, Eric? I mean, you've done a lot of things.
Yeah. I'm trying to think like what would be like a good kind of path for me. And the thing that I keep coming back to, and um I think it might be my next project that I work on, but I'm really hoping to write like a historical novel, like historical horror. Um, I'm really interested in especially like European history. I'd love to write something from like the 16 or 1700s. I think that would be really
Caitlin,
interesting. Yeah.
you just did medieval. I mean, it's a little bit further back, but
Yeah.
and she's done historical. That's cool. You haven't done that, Eric. I think people would love to see that from you.
Yeah, I think that might be a cool thing to try. I would definitely love that.
Well, everyone heard it here first. We learned a lot today about that. We're going to start wrapping it up with the final question that was asked, I had down for you, and was asked in many different ways. So you can choose to answer it in a variety of ways. We have enough time for you to have decent answers. So we have a whole bunch of library workers here. They want to know what you're reading. Some of them specifically want to know authors that are lesser well known. Others just want to know what you like to read, even if it's new or old. And even more, we're asked if like you think people want to just put their toe into horror. Any version of that question, and you can give me multiple answers because we do have enough time. James, let's let you go first.
What I'm reading now, I mean, like I've been reading a lot of different things. I wouldn't say that I wouldn't say that it's a majority horror. I think the last horror novel I read was Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay,
Excellent.
which I found like absolutely. I met him again at the Texas Book Fest, and I was sort of like all up in his business. I was like, this book is like incredible. Like, please just let's talk. Anyway, yeah, horror movie definitely was a horror novel that I've read recently. As far as just other books that I've read, I mean, I just finished The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. I kind of like big sprawling novels like that.
It's like a train wreck in action too, that book.
I read this book called Hotel World. It's an older book by Allie Smith. And it's a ghost story. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful, beautiful ghost story. I read In My Time of Dying by Sebastian Junger. It's nonfiction. It's basically about his brush with death. And that was very, very interesting. It's a very slim book. I think it's like not even 100 pages. But yeah, those are the books that come to mind as far as just recently what I've read and really liked.
I love that range. That's awesome. Thank you. Eric, what about you? And also, oh wait, before we go, Paul Tremblay horror movie, star review by me in Booklist. Excellent, excellent book. And I know that he's one of Eric's mentors too. So what a great
Yeah.
segue there.
Yeah, I love Paul, love horror movies, such an amazing book. Yeah, I mean, the books that I read, they're not necessarily books that you could probably give to your patrons and say, this is a good way to like dip your toe into the
Wait
genre.
a second, we give out your books and they love them. So let's,
Okay, all right.
so let's,
I meant like the books I read. Like some of the books I read, maybe not so much, but like there are two books that I'm thinking of that I read recently that I absolutely loved. And if your patrons are you know, curious about like extreme, more like disturbing horror content, um, I heartily recommend The Dumb House by John Burnside, which is not marketed as horror. It's more of like a literary novel, but very disturbing. It's about this psychopath who decides he's going to test this theory about whether or not language is innate to all human beings, or if it's something that like we're taught over time, or you know, that's kind of the premise of the book. And it's just so disturbing, so beautifully written, really lyrical, Baroque writing. And then the second book I'm thinking of is called The End of Alice by A.M. Holmes, which is told from the perspective of a child molester killer who's serving a life sentence in prison. And he starts to receive correspondence from a 19-year-old girl who has plans to seduce her 12-year-old neighbor. And basically, the whole book is him offering advice to her on how to groom her target, and it's just incredibly disturbing, really, really unsettling to read. And then as far as like authors that I can think of that are maybe like lesser well, I mean, some of them are pretty well known, but I just think, you know, they could always use some more love.
good.
You know, I think of like Haley Piper. She has a book coming out called A Game in Yellow. I think of Gretchen Felker Martin, Manhunt, and
Game in Yellow right
Oh,
here.
you have the Ark. Yeah. No, it's such a good book. I think of Emma E. Murray, who's a really great writer of transgressive fiction. She wrote a book called Crushing Snails, which is really good. Joe Koch, he writes really surreal, disturbing fiction.
I've reviewed one of his in Booklist as well. People can find that.
Yeah, he's a really great writer. Sina Palayo, of course, Forgotten Sisters is an amazing book. David Demchuk, The Bone Mother, Red X. He's a queer writer from Canada. And then Paula D. Ashe, who's an amazing writer. She wrote a book called We Are Here to Hurt Each Other, which is an amazing,
That
amazing.
won the Shirley Jackson, right?
Did it win?
Was nominated. I was
I think it
nominated.
was nominated. Yeah.
And the one you just mentioned, the Butcher's Daughter will be in the next issue of Booklist reviewed by me. So there you go.
Yes.
Thank you. And finally, Caitlin, before we wrap it up, what books do you want to tell all the library workers about? Remember, they can go buy all these for their collections too.
I have been so bad at reading lately. It comes along with the 3 books in 1 year. I really don't recommend doing that to anyone who's like considering. Some people can be very prolific. I am apparently not one of them. But of what I have been able to read, a couple of them are not particularly deep cuts. I mean, I'm sure all of you are familiar with Christopher Buehlman's work. It's fantastic. I love The Lesser Dead and Between Two Fires. I just finished Black Tongue Thief, and now I'm going on to read The Daughter's War. I'm not sure if it's marketed, if Black Tongue Thief is marketed as horror, because it's really just sort of a fantasy story, but it's a fantasy story for people who love horror.
It definitely is.
And I was sorry, that is the sound of my cat's lunch feeder going off. But I love his stuff, and like I would like to be like him when I grow up in terms of being able to hop subgenres like he does, and bring such a different voice to each book. I've also been reading a lot of Tana French because I was late getting on the Dublin Murder Squad boat, but here I am. I pick up one whenever I want to feel uncomfortable and kind of sad by the end of it, but also changed.
Well, at libraries, we love Tana French because the books are connected, but you don't have to read them in order.
You don't.
So we love them.
Then the 2 that maybe are slightly less known, although I think they should be very well known. They're not horror. Like I said, I read very, very widely, so I probably horror makes up maybe an eighth of my reading. Is Isaac Fellman, who wrote the Dead Collections and the 2 Dr. Skorsky, and he has a new book, Notes from a Regicide, coming out, which is sort of like a sci-fi memoir about two trans artists in a fictional dystopic state, and it's their adoptive son who is trying to basically like organize his father's notes and what happened to them. And it's a very intimate, kind of surreal, but just very engrossing story that I was very lucky I got to read an early copy.
And we have time for one more book.
Yes, Kit Mayquist's Tripping Arcadia, which is
Kit Mayquist.
contemporary Gothic horror with lots of poison.
I've read that one too. Thank you, everyone. Oh my gosh, thank you, Eric, James, and Caitlin. This was a wonderful discussion. Tomorrow, all attendees will receive an email containing links to today's video recording, Summer Scares resources, and a certificate of completion. If you missed the middle grade or YA Summer Scares panels, you can find the recordings of both on the Booklist website. The URL is on the screen. It's also on the page for the resource guide. And all of these panels, including panels from previous years, are on the Booklist YouTube page. We definitely recommend you check those out. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. One more huge thank to our panelists, Eric, James, and Caitlin, and to all of you for helping us celebrate Summer Scares. Have a great day.